start talking about buttons. Hello and welcome. I'm Akram Birth, and you're watching Akram's Ideas, bringing creative and crazy ideas to life. Speaking of crazy ideas, a few weekends ago on Instagram, I shared a photo of some of my vintage button collection, and I was talking about in the post that I was preparing to organize all these buttons and was asking followers, like, how do you organize your vintage buttons? What I did not share is the end result of that organization, but I'm sharing it here with you today, and that is this lovely button display rack that does swivel about. So let's back up and talk a little bit about this and how it came to be and so forth. So as many of you know, I love vintage sewing. I love buying all my sewing fabric patterns and notions secondhand, and I come across a lot of vintage buttons and semi-vintage from the 80s and such at antique stores, and typically you can buy them in like a giant pickle jar for 10 bucks. And what I found more and more of actually are buttons that are still on cards. Some of them I do have that just come, you know, all loose, but I've collected over the years a lot of buttons that are on cards. And for a long time, I've just been storing them in those little plastic drawers that you can get on wheels. I have 2 carts of those, and I've just been storing them in there. And I tried to sort them by color, but I had so many buttons that it was very difficult. And if I needed to find a set of buttons for a project, basically my solution was to take out a drawer, lay down some newspaper, dump the drawer, and, you know, dig through it until I could find what I wanted, which is not always the best solution. And again, being in a drawer like that, the button cards were getting kind of beat up and things like that. So my husband, who frequents Craigslist, which is basically like an online garage sale type site, they post things like, here's something for sale, you know, message me if you're interested. He came across a listing for buttons and the rack that it comes on. And I was unsure. When he first mentioned it to me, I was like, you know what, I've got a ton of buttons. I don't need any more buttons. And he's like, yeah, but it comes with the rack. And of course, we did not know the scale of this rack. We thought it was more like this rack, which was also part of the sale. We thought it was like a tabletop rack, and we thought this was probably about the size of it was. This wasn't even pictured in the pictures. So we thought it was more like this, and he said, you know, it could be a display, you could put some of your buttons on it, and it came with buttons. So it was like $120 for 2 racks with the buttons. And we're like, okay. I gave in. I was like, okay, you're right. I can use it as decoration. So we drove down to this little town outside of Tulsa, where this elderly couple lived, and they were the ones selling it. They had purchased the racks from a business there in town who was going out of business several years ago. And since then, they'd gotten older. The lady had sewn, and she wasn't sewing anymore, and they wanted to get rid of it. And it came with a ton of buttons already on it, on both of them. So there was a little tabletop one here, and I'm going to bring you in and take a look at this a little bit closer. But what I was not expecting is the sheer size of this one. As you can see, it's almost my height. It doesn't go all the way to the floor. There is a base, and like I said, I'll bring you in closer so you can see it. So the last week since posting that photo on Instagram, from that day, you know, for a week or so, I was sorting buttons. I took all the buttons off of the rack itself. Most of them had tipped over when we had it in the car and bringing it home. So I took all the buttons off the rack, and I took all the buttons that I had in my stash that were also on cards. And I sorted everything. They were like on the floor in this room for like a week. I was like, everything was sorted. I had them in bins, like sorting them by color and so forth. And obviously these here are the smaller narrow ones, and it came with some, and of course I actually had some of these as well that I could put on here. So let me bring the camera over and kind of show you what's going on here. Here is the button rack, and if I just kind of pan down, let's see how far I can pan down, you can see it goes down all the way, and then there's this base to it. And the base is about the size of a small coffee table, and it's not off the ground very high. There is a little bit of room, which I put some shoe boxes with some loose buttons in underneath. But this is basically the button rack here, and or the main button rack anyways. So just kind of showing you how this works, or how I've organized this button rack. And you can see I still have a few a few hooks here that I haven't filled out. This is for the blacks. I have more blacks than will actually fit on the rack after fitting everything else, and I might have to shift some stuff around a little bit. But I kind of, originally I started with white and then had to shift things around. So the way I've got it so far is that down here, if I pan down here, so down here is where the whites start, and they go all the way until they get into an ivory color, and then the ivory color over here blends into the yellows, and the yellows blend into the orange through the gold. I think I'm going to flip that around because I don't have a lot of orange, and I think the orange will transition better to red. So again, I'm going to do some shifting, but it goes from orange to gold right now, and then from gold to brown, which again, I think I'm going to shift everything around after I got it on here, because some of my greens have brown undertones that I think would shift better into the brown, and then into the dark grays and so forth. So I might do some shifting, but right now it goes into browns that go into maroon, that go into red, that go into pink down at the bottom there, right there. And then if I spin it around again, I've got my lavenders that go into navy, that go into blue, that come back up over on this side. And we have our turquoise buttons that go into mint, that go into green, that come over here. And these over here go from the hunter green colors into the taupes, into the browns, or tans I should say, and then it goes into light gray, moving back into a dark gray, and then over here it's going to go into black, and then go back into a dark gray that leads into a light gray, into silver, into white. So that's kind of how I've got the color gradient going at the moment on this rack.
To see more episodes like this, be sure to click the like button, subscribe to Akram's Ideas, and hit the bell icon to get notified of new episodes.
And I love it. I love it. I absolutely love it. I love it because I can see everything. Now, some of these racks have, like, let me see if I can't find a good example here. Like this one here, these are all the same buttons right here. So I had multiples, and what was interesting is that going through my stash, like I got this rack and it had some buttons on it, but then I found in my stash that I had some matching buttons to that. So I tried to match up as many buttons as I could. Sometimes if I didn't have matching buttons, like sometimes like in this case here, I have a small set, but then I also have a large set, so they match, they're just different sizes. But again, if I didn't have matching buttons, I tried to find buttons that were similar-ish, that I could stack on top of each other, so I could find not only the same color of buttons, but similar-ish buttons. It's like, oh, this isn't quite right, but oh, look, there's one behind it that might work better. So I tried to stack them on top of each other just to make more room and buttons that were similar together. I really love how it turned out, and the fact that I can just quickly come over here and start digging through them makes it so convenient and makes me want to sew more projects with buttons. But now I can see them all and get a sense for what colors I have, what projects they might be good for, and so forth and so forth. So I am just super happy. I'm really happy. I love the teal ones here. I've got a lot of teal buttons, so you know, it just makes me happy to see these on display all the time. I wasn't sure, especially after we got there. I saw the size of the thing. I'm like, is it gonna fit? I've got it over here in the corner. It's kind of part of my little set now, as I call it. But I do love it. It makes it look like a little shopping store. So this is really happy with it. On this side, like I said, this was just a little tabletop one, so not quite as big as the other one. And this one is actually made for this Slimline brand of buttons. Slimline brand of buttons has the number on the back of the button that tells you what number on the rack it goes on, which is really nice. So all of these are actually organized by the button rack itself. Now I had some Slimline buttons, so I put them on the rack accordingly, but then I had some buttons like this one here. It's called Classic. It's not a Slimline button, but they're on these slim tabs. But I had a lot of empty spaces on here. So what I did is I saw what the Slimline, like here you can see this is a lavender. I had an empty space. I put some more purple colors that I had of other brands on there. So they're not exactly all part of this brand, but they're the same type, and I try to keep them consistent with how the colors were being organized on the rack traditionally. So I'm very happy with this one as well. These are more very simplified, just colored buttons, but I love them. And I also love that they start off with the small buttons on the top, medium-sized button, larger buttons, and then also it's a glossy colors on the top, glossy colors in the middle, and then it goes into small buttons and medium-sized buttons that are matte as you go down the rack. And that's kind of how it's organized, based on how the rack is designed to hold those kind of colored buttons. So that is my button organization. And I know it's not for everybody. I mean, what are the odds that you're gonna come across a shop display for buttons at such a reasonable price, and for it to come with buttons as well, which was a big shocker, you know, to get such a deal with all of this. And I'm just really happy with it. Again, I was a little overwhelmed because of the scale of it. And again, like I said, this probably won't work for everybody, because if you don't have room, it may just be too big. I mean, it may end up like in the middle of the living room. Lucky for me, I have sort of this pattern room, as I call it, where I can set this. It's just another spare bedroom that we have where I've got this little set up, and I've got all my patterns in here. And maybe I'll give a tour once it's clean, because the other side of the room is, you don't even want to look at it. But I'm fortunate to have this space that this does work, and it makes a great set prop. I absolutely love it. I feel like I'm in my own little sewing shop, and it just makes me happy every time that I see it and then get to look at all my buttons. It's like looking at your fabric stash. I mean, even if you don't have time to like sew, just going and like touching the fabric and like looking at it can bring you happiness. At least for me, I'm sure many of you are like that. And seeing the buttons does the same thing. It's like, oh, I love these buttons. So I'm really happy with it. I love to hear in the comments below how you store your buttons and what button organization tips you have. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Akram's Ideas, and thanks for watching.
The odds that you're gonna come around. Many of you First off, what are the odds? And speaking of crazy ideas, oh, I love these.